All right, well, we'll give folks another minute to get attached, to get their audios in place, and then we'll get started. So if you want to patient for another moment. All right. Mitzi's having trouble getting connected, but maybe we'll give another few seconds. All right, well, in the interest of time, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar in the 2021 Spring Science Seminar Series, brought to you by the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. So my name's Carrie Furness, and I'm the program manager here at the Southeast CASC. And in this virtual seminar series, we are highlighting CCASC funded projects that support resource management actions across the Southeast. So I think that gives us a context for what you're about to hear. And now just give you an idea of what to expect during this actual webinar. So we'll go over a bit of the webinar logistics and including getting some feedback via a short poll so we can know who's with us today. And then we'll introduce our speaker for the day. And he'll present for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end before we wrap up. So now I'll pass the mic over to Ashlyn Shore, communications specialist here at the Southeast CASC, and she's going to give us a quick intro to our Zoom interface.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie, and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Carrie mentioned, I'm just quickly going to cover the features of the Zoom interface that we're going to use for today's webinar, though I'm sure pretty much everyone is pretty familiar with Zoom at this point. So as noted on the slide down here in the bottom left corner, these controls are going to allow you to connect to the audio using either your computer or your phone, where you can call into this number here if you prefer to use your phone audio. So this is also where you could mute and unmute your audio. And those who are choosing to join us by phone this morning, *6 is the code that you can use to mute or unmute yourself. So we will keep all lines muted throughout the presentation and just ask that you also keep your video off so we can lessen distractions throughout the discussion this morning. So in the middle of the bottom bar on your Zoom interface, you can access the chat window. And I'd encourage you, if any questions come up during the presentation, to go ahead and submit your questions in the chat for discussion after the talk. We will be monitoring the questions there, and we'll post them to our speaker during the Q&A session. Just so everyone knows, we will be recording today's webinar, and you can then access and share the recording afterwards from the Southeast CASC website, our Science Series webpage, and our YouTube channel. So that is all from me this morning. So I'll pass it back to you, Carrie.
Great, thanks, Ashlyn. So now we'd like to just launch a short poll just to get a bit of information about who's with us today, so that might help James know what to expect as far as interest and questions, and also will help us know how to get information out about these ongoing webinar series. So give you just about 30 seconds to fill that out. Yeah, so it looks like we've got a nice range of folks with us today. So I'll go ahead and end that and share those results. So state agencies win. And thanks for reading the Southeast CASC newsletter. So let me drop that. So thanks for giving us that information. So now we'll move on to our presentation. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Patrick Cronin. James is a research ecologist at the USGS Wetland and Aquatic Research Center in Lafayette, Louisiana. His projects generally focus on developing causal models that can inform ecological theory and aid natural resource managers and planners. Some specific areas of research include trophic interactions, infectious diseases, functional traits, and coastal landscape conservation and restoration, with a focus on threatened, endangered, and at-risk species. James has led a CASC project identifying conservation objectives for several beach nesting birds, which was part of a larger project in the northern Gulf of Mexico, which he'll tell us a little bit more about today as well. So the title of his talk is Strategic Habitat Conservation for the Brown Pelican, Estimating Habitat Objectives and Management Scenario Efficiencies. So now I'll turn it over to you, James.
All right, thank you for the kind introduction, Carrie. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Looks great.
Great, okay. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about strategic habitat conservation for brown pelican in the northern Gulf of Mexico coast. But this project, as Carrie mentioned, is part of a larger project. So I first want to give you that context, and then we'll focus on brown pelicans. Some of you might have seen this and know this context, so I apologize if it's a little redundant, but I think that context is important. Of course, the work that I'm going to present today was a team effort. And so some of the key players were Blair Turpak, Virginia Brink, Leah Dale, and John Turpak. Okay, so many species in the Gulf of Mexico are of conservation concern due to common stressors such as habitat loss or depredation. And so there's been increased funding to implement habitat management actions that are meant to mitigate those stressors, but there's a lot of uncertainty about the ability of those management actions to actually achieve the population objectives of the critters that they're supposed to help. So there's been a call for quantitative spatial tools that can help managers establish explicit habitat objectives. So the goal of this larger project was to provide those types of tools to what we call the biological objectives for the Gulf Coast Working Group, which consists of natural resource managers and planners from fish and wildlife programs or conservation partnerships across the Gulf. So you might recognize some of these individuals. So in 2013, the Fish and Wildlife Service published a document called the Vision for a Healthy Gulf of Mexico Watershed, and that document identified focal conservation areas across the Gulf, which are shown here in red. And as you can see, these areas have fuzzy boundaries, but we can't have fuzzy boundaries if we want to explicitly define population, if we want to explicitly define biological objectives. So the first tool that the working group developed was a map of 16 biological planning units, which I'm showing you here in the solid colors. And to meet the needs of aquatic species, we also included a marine planning unit, which is here in the blue, and some aquatic extensions, which are shown here in the hash mark areas to address the needs of things that maybe swim upriver further from the coast, things like Gulf sturgeon. The second tool that we developed was a list of 166 federal trust species and their population objectives in each planning unit. So I'm just showing you a few species here, which include mice and some birds and a fish. So for example, the brown pelican, its population objectives are in breeding pairs. This is a footnote, not squared, it's just breeding pairs. So for example, in the Laguna Madre and Lower Rio Grande River Valley, the breeding pair objective for brown pelican is 1,460 breeding pairs. Whereas say over in the Central Gulf and Florida Panhandle coast, the population objective is 3,143. So these population objectives were obtained or derived from existing plans, such as recovery or regional plans. Our third set of tools were models that relate species to habitat characteristics. So for example, this is the brown pelican model. It's a Bayesian network model, and it predicts the nest count on an island. So we'll be talking about this. So these models are interactive. So when you can open it up in a software package and it looks just like this, and you can click on the variables and enter in habitat characteristics, and then observe what the predicted probability distribution is for nest counts on an island. So that is considering a scenario, say where managers are just thinking about an individual island. but we can put together, we can assemble or collate geospatial data sets for islands across the entire Gulf, and then feed those into the models to make predictions across the landscape. And then we can use these types of outputs to predict things like population sizes or calculate habitat objectives or the efficiency of different management scenarios. So for example, if we use the outputs to target specific islands, maybe we only need 29 more hectares to achieve a population objective, which is far more efficient than a random strategy, where we're randomly targeting islands, which is, say, similar to a common practice of opportunistic conservation and restoration. So we've made these models for things like Gulf sturgeon, 3 subspecies of beach mice, black skimmer, gold-billed tern, and brown pelican. And of course, today we're going to focus on brown pelican. All right, so brown pelican, they were listed as endangered in 1970, and they're delisted in 2009 due to population recovery. Pelicans, they form breeding colonies on a limited number of islands, at least in the northern Gulf of Mexico. So for example, we identified 31,577 islands, which we defined as land that's surrounded by water that is less than 21 kilometers to the mainland. And of all those islands, on average, there's about 92 plus or minus 7 observed colonies per year. And this is just based on data between 2000 to 2015. So the islands that the pelicans use they consist of different habitats that pelicans use for different reasons. So here's an example island. And so you have some low bare ground that's, say, below 0.3 meters above sea level. And they'll use this type of habitat for loafing. And then there's some higher patches of bare ground, which you can see up here, but with a more zoomed in image here. And they will also use this higher bare ground for nests, but their preferred nesting habitat is vegetation. So storms and sea level rise can erode or destroy habitats or even entire islands. And depredation by coyotes and raccoons can cause the breeding colonies to fail, and as can human disturbance. So the goal of this project was to estimate habitat objectives, so the amount of area that's needed to achieve a population objective, and to estimate management plan efficiency. So what's the relative effort in terms of area that is needed to achieve the population objective under different plans. So what I'm showing you down here are the plan units, which I've color coded according to the biological planning unit map. So we have the Laguna Madre, the Texas Midcoast, the Chenier Plain, the Mississippi River Delta, the Central Gulf and Florida Panhandle Coast, the Florida Big Bend, Tampa Bay, the Caloosahatchee River, the Everglades, and the Florida Keys. So that's 10 BPUs where we identified breeding pair population objectives for brown pelican. Okay, so in order to develop a model to get at these 2 goals here, I'm going to take you through our modeling workflow. So the first thing that we do is we define a purpose in the study area, and we do that by working with that biological objectives working group and by reading the recovery plan for the critter. We then hypothesize what I'll call a graphical causal model. You might have heard these referred to as influence diagrams, but they're just box and arrow diagrams that transparently show how the world works, how we think the world works for a species. So in this toy example here, right, X is causing Y and Y is causing Z. So what this just means is if X were to change or vary, either naturally or because we manipulated it experimentally, or because we went in and conducted some management action, that would cause Y to change and that would cause Z to change. So these causal models, we develop and we draft them based off the recovery plans, because the recovery plans highlight a lot of important habitat characteristics and threats to the species. And then we delve further into the literature. Once we have a draft of these, then we have a team of species experts that review our hypothesized causal model. And so in this, and we get feedback from them. So in this case, I'm just saying, oh, well, the expert, thinks that E also causes Z, right? So maybe this expert, and after we talk to them for a bit, maybe it becomes clear that the expert knows or they believe that E directly influences Z, or that it's indirectly influencing Z because, say, E also causes Y, right? So here's we're going to walk through the structure of this because it's easier to, I think, to look at the causal model than it is to actually look at the Bayes net. So, and what we're going to focus on here is we're going to walk through these middle or internal variables, which are nest count, the propensity for an island to be used for nests, the potential for an island to support local predator populations, the realized predator presence, and the effectiveness of predator management. So for nest count, we hypothesize that the number of nests on an island increases with the propensity because brown pelicans often return to their natal site to nest. And it might increase with shrub area or high bare ground area because those are their nesting habitats. And with total island area, because larger islands provide more refugia, say from overwash or for erosion, but it might decrease at large island areas due to a greater frequency of intense human disturbance. And the effect of these habitat characteristics might vary by region. For propensity of nests, that might increase with shrub area or with the amount of low bare ground or with total island area. But it might decrease on very large islands or islands with a lot of bare ground like beaches because of a greater frequency of human disturbance. The propensity for an island to be used for nesting might decrease with the presence of predators, or it might decrease as the connection to the mainland increases because the mainland is a large source of, because they have a lot of human disturbance on them. It might also decrease with the human density at the nearest boat launch, because that's also, say, a metric of potential for human disturbance. Propensity for nests might also might be 0 if it's not in the current breeding range. So we didn't have any evidence of breeding colonies between 2000 and 2015 that were in the Florida Keys. So this would apply there. And so finally, these relationships might vary regionally. So for predator presence might be greater on islands that have a greater potential to support predators, and they might be greater on islands that have a lot of potential in the surrounding neighborhood, on islands surrounding it. And it might be lower on islands where there's some management action that is being effective at controlling them. So local predator potential, it might increase with shrub area, with the total island area, or with the elevation of the island, and it might be greater on islands that are more highly connected. Oh, and I forgot to highlight this arrow here. So those relationships could also vary regionally. And in terms of predator management effectiveness, the effectiveness of predator management, right, depends upon whether or not there's even some action to manage them. It might decrease as with local predator potential. So if there's a lot of predator potential on the island, then it might be harder to control them. And it might be more difficult to control them to be effective at predator management as the connectivity to the mainland increases because there's more predator pressure. And these relationships, again, can vary regionally. Okay, so once we have our graphical causal model, we then translate into a Bayesian network. So here's our Bayesian network, and it's got two important additions. We added a variable that is a biological planning unit because these habitat characteristics might vary within the biological planning units. And we added a total habitat constraint because the amount of shrub and high bare ground and low bare ground can't sum to greater than the area. So we wanted the model to not create islands that just don't exist, right, due to just a physical constraint. So Bayesian network models, they're discrete probabilistic models. So when I say discrete, I mean that each variable is divided into unique bins. So for example, if you look at nest count, there's a bin that is 0. And there's a bin that says 0 to 17. It's actually 1 to less than 17, and then 17 to less than 80, right? So this is a count is a continuous variable, but we still have to discretize them. Other ones, so like local predator management. So there might be no removal, or they might be removing them as needed, or there might be constant removal. And predator management effectiveness, right? There might, if they're not removing them, then right, there's just no removal. But if they're taking some action, you know, it could be ineffective removal, it could be effective removal. So when I say probabilistic, that means that each bin occurs at a certain probability. So the numbers next to these bins just indicate that that's the probability that this is the outcome. And it's the magnitude of the bar just reflects the magnitude of the number there. And for the continuous variables, there's expected values down at the bottom. And these are just, these are values that are calculated from the midpoint. It's integrating across all of these bins, but it's taking into account the bin midpoint and the probability. So without entering any evidence into the model or any habitat characteristics, right, if we were to just randomly select an island in the Northern Gulf, it's most likely to be in the Mississippi River Delta. It's most likely to not have any predator management. It's most likely to be medium connected. There's the most probable for neighborhood potential is that there's a lot of potential. It's greater than 0.5 up to 1. Realized predator presence is most likely to have predators on the island, but nest count is most, we're quite certain that there are no nests on an island that if we were to just randomly grab one. In other islands, you can see they've got a lot more uncertainty. So like maximum elevation, there's a lot of the probabilities distributed across a lot of the bins. Okay, so the way that we learn these probabilities is for these external habitat variables that are in red, those come from geospatial data sets. And so just the frequency of those characteristics. For the ones for more of these internal variables that are in blue, we can learn those probabilities from case files. So these are just data sets that contain like a limited number of islands, and then we analyze those data sets. You can also learn those relationships from the literature or from expert opinion. I can't possibly go through all of these quantitative relationships, right? So I'm just showing you our error rates and our ability to predict these internal boxes, right? Happy to discuss how we do that with anyone afterwards. Okay, so, but what I want to do is I want to give you a basic idea about how BNs work. So BNs make their predictions using conditional probability tables. So here's the realized predator presence conditional probability table. So it shows the combinations of each variable and the outcomes for realized predators. So in this column, we have local predators, local predator potential, which is this variable here, right? That's influencing realized predator presence. It has 2 bins, no and yes. And so we have 2 bins, it's 2 bins, no and yes. Predator management, there's no removal. There's 3 classes, no removal, ineffective, and effective. So there's its 3 classes. Neighborhood predator potential, it has 2 classes, 0 to 0.5 and 0.5 to 1. So we've got those. And then for the realized predators, there's 2 classes, no or yes, which is no and yes here. So essentially here, if we just look at the first row, if local predators are no and predator management potential is no removal. So there's no predators, there's local predator potential is there's just no predator potential. Predator management effectiveness is there is no removal of them. And there's a low potential for neighborhood, for predators in the neighborhood, then we're quite certain that the realized predators presence is no. And at least there's a 93% probability, and the remaining probability out of 100% is in yes. So there's a little bit of uncertainty, but we're quite certain not. So what we can do is we can see these probabilities play out when we use the model. So we can enter no into local predator potential, we can enter no removal into predator management effectiveness, and we can enter in that the neighborhood predator potential is less than 0.5. And so we get 93 and effectively 7. I just rounded it here in the table to make the table a little easier to look at. But let's say that we didn't know what local predator potential is, right? We haven't entered in any evidence here. So it could be no, or it could be yes. So these probabilities here for, right, or predicting for realized predator presence, we don't find those probabilities in the conditional probability table. And that's because these predictions are accounting for all of the uncertainty that is associated with not knowing local predator potential. So we have some uncertainty here within these and, you know, between them. And then when we look at local predator potential itself, right, there's a high probability that it's no, but there's a decent probability that they might be there. And these probabilities are accounting for all of the uncertainty within the local predator potential conditional probability table. So there's a table that underlies this one as well. And hence all the other variables that are influencing local predator potential within the larger network. So it's propagating and accounting for that uncertainty in order to make this prediction. We can also do backwards inference. So we could hypothesize that realized predator presence is no, and then we can infer what the most probable states of these other variables are in the network, right? Okay, so once we have a Bayes net, once we have that built, then what we do is we have species expert review. So we can revise the geospatial data sets. So maybe the experts know something about a site that we didn't know. And so we can reconcile with them if needed. And we can revise the relationships. So if they're going through and looking at the probabilities and playing with the model and seeing how it behaves, maybe it doesn't meet their expectations. And so we can try to reconcile that. And then we have them look at the model outputs to see if it meets their expectations. Okay, so after all of that work, then we have a decision support tool. And of course, in this case, we're interested in using that model to ask, what is the nest demand? So are we over or under the population objective for each planning unit? What are the habitat objectives for each planning unit? And what are the management efficiencies for each planning unit? Okay, so we're going to first focus on how we calculate nest demand. So let's say that we have an island in the central Gulf and Florida Panhandle coast, and it's a medium connected island, and it's got all these habitat characteristics, which result in this predicted probability distribution for the nest count. And so you can see here that the most probable bin is 17 to 80 nests. Now, there's a lot of probability that's spread across these other bins, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to sample this distribution instead of directly choosing one of those. So let's say that we have an island, our first island, and we take our first sample, and the most likely outcome is 17 to 80, right? Is 17 to 80. That's the most probable bin. And we could sample it again, and the next most likely one is 0 to 17. It might not play out this way, but let's just say it does. So we can sample this distribution 1,000 times. So maybe on the 1,000th one, we get 0, right? Because there's actually, you know, a substantial probability here that we might get no nests. We then take the midpoint. So if first the midpoint of 17 to 80 is 48.5, the midpoint of 0 to 17 is 8, and the midpoint of 0 is just 0. So we could do that for all 31,577 islands. So each island, we went through and we sampled its predicted probability distribution for nests 1,000 times. And then what we can do is to calculate the nest demand for a BPU. In this case, the example I'm using, the central Gulf and Florida Panhandle coast. So let's say we sum it up for that for all of the islands in that planning units, their first samples. And let's say we've only summed up 799. So the breeding pair population objective is 3,143. So we have a we're short 2,344, right? But maybe in the second one, after we sum all the islands up from the random samples, we've got 6,532. So here we're well over it. We're over it by 3,389. So this is going to vary because all the islands have these different distributions associated with them, right? And we're random sampling it. So we can get a distribution of what this demand is across these 1,000 samples for each island. So ignore the table on the left just for a second here. So here's what the distribution, an example distribution from the Central Gulf and Florida Panhandle coast looks like. So here, the nest demand, we have a couple samples that where the nest demand was below zero. Right? So that means that what we have in hand is greater than the population demand. But you can see that most of them are well above zero. So what I'm showing you here are the quantiles. So there's a 2.5% quantile, a 50% quantile, and 97.5% quantile. So the 50% just means that of those 1,000 samples, a half of them are below 2,617, and half of the other half are above 2,617. So I just took these quantiles and I tossed them over into this table here, because we're going to look at these instead of looking at a bunch of distributions. So you can see that there's a demand in half the simulations. And this doesn't encompass zero. So we're really confident that the habitat, that the population objective in this BPU has not been met. And so thus, the current amount of habitat is insufficient to meet the population objective. So there were 4 BPUs where the nest objective was not met in at least half of the half or more of the simulations. So you can see the Mississippi River Delta, some of the simulations are actually below, meeting it, but for the majority of them, that's not the case. So the question here is, so thus these 4 BPUs, they require strategic management actions to increase the nest counts by improving habitat. And of course, the question is which islands and what action should we take on them? But before we look at that, we can look at the other 6 where the objectives were met in almost all of the simulations. So all of these are below, right? They're not encompassing zero, they're below zero. So even though the objective is met here, managers can still be strategic by targeting specific islands to maintain the habitats on them. So we're going to walk through about how we do that. So just focus on this column here. So what we just did is we sampled each island's predicted nest distribution 1,000 times and then summed it up across the whole BPU. For the BPUs where the population objectives, for those 6 of them where it was met, instead of just summing across all the islands, what we can do is we could just randomly select islands until the population objective is met, or we could go after the islands that have the highest nest count first. And we're just going to keep grabbing those islands to meet the population objective. And as we're sampling those islands, either in that random way or in a targeted way, we can track those islands, and we can keep track of the amount of habitat on them in terms of the shrub, low bear, and high bear. And so I'm just going to sum these up and call them total habitat. For the 4 where the population objective is not met, we have to identify potential target islands, and then we have to what I'm going to call querying the BayesNet for management actions. So basically what that's going to do is it's going to select islands. We're going to identify management actions using the model, doing those 2 things using the model. Then we're going to toss those islands back into the pool, and then we're going to randomly sample or targeted sample islands until we hit the population objective. But I want to walk you through how we do this. Okay, so what we first did is to identify the potential target islands. We didn't allow any high connected islands, right? So here's our connection to mainland. If we assume that the island is highly connected, we always have 0 nests on highly connected islands, as predicted by the model. And that's because human disturbance is so great on those islands, as is predation, predator potential. We also then we didn't include any islands that had high neighborhood predator potential. right? So if we exclude high islands and only look at the low and medium islands, if we allow neighborhood predator potential to be high, like greater than 0.5 to 1, then we still get no nests. And that's because this predation potential is just is too strong to allow for breeding colonies. We also, so that gave us a pool of islands, and then we visually inspected those islands in 2018 Google Earth to make sure that they weren't now water, either due to sea level rise or storms, that they didn't have any development on them, such as oil or agriculture infrastructure, and no fragments. So the land cover often fragments the islands. So maybe there's just a pixel hanging off a corner of an island. It really belongs to the larger island, so we wouldn't consider those little fragments. And then we assigned islands to a cluster. So if islands were within a 1 kilometer radius from each other, they were technically, we just bin them in the same cluster. So that'll become important in a minute. So when we do that, we had anywhere from, say, in the Chenier Plain, 15 to 20 islands, or up in the Florida Keys, say over 100 islands that had some management potential. So then what we're going to do is, once we've identified those islands in those BPUs that have some management potential, we're then going to also use the model to query for each of those target islands potential management action. So again, let's say we're in the Central Gulf and Florida Panhandle coast, and we're on a medium connected island, and it's got all these habitat characteristics, including it doesn't have any shrub on it, it doesn't have any high bare ground, and it doesn't have any low bare ground. So we can't change things like how connected it is to the mainland, right? We're not going to move the island. And we can't change things like the density of the human population at the nearest boat launch. And we want to hold off on changing maximum elevation or the total area, that island area, because those are probably really expensive things to do. So what we first focused on is, can we considered managing shrub, the high bare ground, and the low bare ground. So to do that, when we query the model, what we're going to do is we're going to hypothesize that that the management actions to shrub, high bare ground, and low bare ground are going to at least achieve the median nest count for an island in its region and of its connection to mainland. So in the eastern region, for islands that are medium connected, the median nest count from 2000 to 2015 was 120. And so that's between 80 and 160, right? That fits into this nest count bin. And then we're just, once we hypothesize that and keep all of its other habitat characteristics constant, we can use backward inference to get the most probable shrub or high bare ground or low bare ground estimate, or their expected values, and needed to achieve this nest count value. And then what we do is then we go back and we hypothesize those management actions by using that most probable or expected value for the shrub, high bare, and low bare ground in order to predict a new nest count distribution, which then we can resample. I do want to say that I mentioned earlier that in the Florida Keys, for the current breeding range in the Florida Keys, they didn't fit into that current, the Florida Keys Biological Planning Unit, its current breeding range is no. And so what we didn't query the model for that BPU for its habitat objectives. Instead, what we did is we hypothesized that, that it was within the breeding range to simulate introductions. And then what we do is we record its new nest count. All right. There are two additional constraints that we put in here. So we didn't allow for habitat loss. So if the model returned, say that we had to get rid of high bare ground and the island already had it, or we had to get rid of low bare ground and the island already had it, we didn't allow that to happen because those habitats can be important for other species. And then we limited the number of islands to 1 island per cluster because we thought that managers, at least at a first step, might want to focus on management actions spread across their biological planning unit, say maybe for like metapopulation reasons. Okay, so then what we've done is I just showed you how we identify a bucket of potential target islands, and then how we query the islands for the management actions. So then we take those islands and we toss them back into the pool, like I mentioned before, and then we randomly sample islands in the BPU, or we select islands in a targeted fashion by grabbing the ones that have the highest nest counts first, and then we're summing those up until we hit the population objective. So here are the 4 BPUs whose population objective was unmet given the current conditions. And the results here are from implementing the queried habitat management actions, and we've implemented this either in a random or a targeted way. So what you can see is in the Mississippi River Delta, these quantiles are all below 0. So this was sufficient to meet the nest demand in the Mississippi River Delta, and it was sufficient in the Florida Keys. In the Central Gulf and in the Central Gulf here, and in the in the Chenier Plain, and in the Central Gulf and Florida Panhandle coast, it is being met in at least half of the simulations. And when we're tracking our total habitat and we're keeping track of how many islands we need, we can see that we're being the targeted and is much more efficient than the random. So for example, in Mississippi River Delta, maybe 50% of the simulations, we need 45 total hectares of habitat if we're selecting islands randomly, but we can achieve it if we're being targeted in only 29. Same with the number of islands. That 45 hectares is spread across, say, 11 islands, but maybe only 6 if we're being targeted. So in other words, instead of looking at all these, we can calculate the percent decrease. So specifically, if we move from a random strategy to a targeted strategy, there's a large percent decrease in both the amount of area and the number of islands that are needed to hit the population objectives. Okay, so then if we look at and we get the same result if we're looking at the other 6 BPUs where the population objective was already met. So you've already basically seen numbers like this, so it's met for all the 6. And if we're looking at the total habitat efficiencies and the total number of island efficiencies, we can see that as we move from a random to a targeted strategy, we're a lot more efficient for both of these metrics. So let's go back and look at the Chenier Plain and the Central Gulf and Florida Panhandle coast, because this might not, the fact that we've got a lot of uncertainty still here in whether or not we're meeting the population objectives for those 2 BPUs. So although half of them are being met, right, there's a lot that are not. So what we can do is we can return to our model and query it again. And this time, what I considered is we might take some management actions to change the maximum elevation and to change the total area of the island. But we had 2 constraints when we did that. We didn't allow any loss of the island area or of the elevation, right? Because we don't think that managers are going to say, oh yeah, let's shrink an island or reduce its elevation, because we have enough problems going on with those 2 due to climate change things. So when we do that, that process worked for the Chenier Plain, but it didn't solve it for the Central Gulf and Florida Panhandle coast. So we can go back, and I've tried a couple of other things to crack, to solve it. So one thing that I've done is I've increased predator management from no to as needed. And I've increased the number of islands per cluster. And this has some justification in the eastern region, because there are cases where pelican colonies will be on one island for a few years, and then they'll move their breeding colony to a nearby island and be there for a couple of years. And so they'll hop around. But neither of these have given me in the simulations a scenario where I can actually meet the population objectives for the Central Gulf and Florida Panhandle coast. So there's some more work to be done there. Okay, so that's a ton of information. So I just want to go over to summarize what we've done. So we developed the quantitative decision support tool and spatial data sets for the northern Gulf of Mexico. And we use those to predict nest counts on 31,577 northern GOM islands. And we estimated nest demands, habitat objectives, and management efficiencies for 10 of the biologic planning units that had population objectives for brown pelicans. So we then, the results were that the current habitat met 6 of those biological planning units population objectives. And if we targeted islands for maintaining their habitat, that was a much more efficient strategy than just randomly, aka opportunistically, grabbing islands. Current habitat did not meet 4 of the biological planning units population objectives. So what we did is we identified, we used the model to identify potential target islands, and then we use it to identify management actions to achieve the median nest count given an island's region and its connectivity. And targeted implementation of these management actions efficiently helped it to efficiently achieve 3 out of the 4 biological planning units population objectives. Okay, so for future work, in terms of the nest demands, habitat objectives, and management efficiencies, obviously we'd like to resolve it for the Central Gulf and Florida Panhandle coast. For the model relationships, there's a lot of uncertainty in the conditional probability tables for propensity and nest counts. Some of that is fueled by the fact that in the east, sometimes the pelicans hop around from island to island, and that increases the uncertainty in the CPTs. There's also some potential that we might be missing habitat characteristic that's important in the islands in the eastern region. In terms of the model inputs, so we haven't gone through and run climate change scenarios. So obviously we'd like to be able to feed in, say, new land cover and generate outputs for future climate change scenarios. And of course, we'd like to collaborate more intimately with managers. So I showed you in our modeling workflow those 6 kind of panels about how we develop it. And so basically that's getting us to a tool where we can run these simulations and see if we can actually solve some problems achieving those habitat objectives, those population objectives. But I think we need to work kind of more closely with managers to sort of vet those islands and the actions within those BPUs. And so that could also be helpful for resolving this Central Gulf and Florida Panhandle coast. Okay, so with that, of course, our biological objectives project team was really critical. We had a great group of species experts. The manuscripts, so the beach mice and the Gulf sturgeon manuscripts are published, and therefore the BayesNet and the inputs and outputs for those are available on ScienceBase. And so we'll do the same with the bird models once they're out in the wild. And of course, we'd like to thank all of our funders. So with that, I will answer any questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, James. That was an awful lot of information, but nicely presented so we could actually follow along, those of us who are not in this world so much maybe. But yes, we'll open it to for questions from the audience. I think that this group is small enough that you can either raise your hand or just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Though if you prefer not to, you can for sure type it in the chat and we'll read it out for James to answer. So.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. I can go back to slides. I know it's a lot of information, and I tried to focus more on less on the quantitative aspect of actually building the model and more on how we can use it to get at strategic habitat conservation.
Yeah, so I'll jump in with the question if there's not one somebody jumping up and down. So you sort of hit it at the end, the question that was brewing in my mind along the way. But so the mechanism or the process for incorporating, climate change, sea level rise scenarios or land use change scenarios is to go back to some of those modules, and is that the process where you just change what your estimated area is, total area, or the low beach area, low ground area. Is that the process for that? And so that would be a lengthy procedure, or what?
Yeah. So what we're doing now is we have Gulf, right? We have our spatial data sets, which are in red here, right? And so what we've been doing is feeding in the current land cover that we have. And so in order to do to look at future scenarios, we would use existing geospatial data sets. So for example, like in Louisiana, there's a coastal master plan and they project land cover and different vegetation types into the future. And so we could just feed those in as new inputs and predict it across that future climate scenario to do that. That assumes that's the most straightforward way. When we're doing that, that's just changing the inputs. It's not changing any of the conditional probability tables that are in here. And so there's an assumption there that, say, predators aren't evolving to respond differently to these habitat characteristics, or brown pelicans aren't evolving to change, say, how they're using islands, right? They'd still be queuing in on the same habitat characteristics. If we do think that they're evolving or modifying their behavior, then we could certainly then update those conditional probability tables. But the most straightforward way is just to just use the projected land cover scenarios to feed those back into the model to get new predictions for the islands that are remaining under those scenarios. Did that answer?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, that's great. Thanks. And I guess the secondary question would be, so what science does this point to that would be most important, in either the climate world or the land cover world, or species adaptation kind of world that would be most helpful to inform this, I guess.
Sorry, say, can you ask that again? I missed the first little bit of the question.
So I guess from the CASC perspective, what science does this point to that would be most relevant to helping move that process? Would it be downscaled climate data, or would it be better spatial land cover estimates of urbanization, for instance, et cetera, that kind of?
Yeah, so we can do sensitivity analyses of the network to identify which variables the uncertainty in nest count is most sensitive to. So here there's not much. So what they do is in this case there's not that much uncertainty, right, in what nest count is. But sometimes, right, this probability distribution is really distributed across a lot of these bins. So what a sensitivity analysis does is it tells you which it ranks variables by the degree to which they reduce our uncertainty, the uncertainty in what the nest count bin is. And I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but when we do that for the brown pelican model, the two big ones are shrub and area, if I remember right. At least they're pretty big players. So that would suggest that that we should really, that managers might want to, or funding agency might really want to focus on improving their geospatial data sets for where shrub is on like where it is distributed across the Gulf, and for defining the size of islands.
Yeah.
So if
Great,
I were to
thank
say
you.
anything about inputs, what they should target, I mean, I'd have to go back and look at those sensitivity analyses, but I know that these two are important.
No, great. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Other folks have a question you want to pose to James?
Did I inundate people with too much? Go too fast? It's a lot to hold on to. It breaks my brain.
It absolutely is. Well, so I'll ask, so is there an intent to make some sort of a user interface such that folks would be able to do some of this testing on, in some sort of web tool?
I'm not sure that there will be a web tool. I haven't had funds to do something like that, but the model itself, it will be available on ScienceBase, and so anybody can download it and anyone can open it up in the software that it was built in is called Medica, and you can download a trial version of the software and open it up in that. You just can't save any changes. So you can use it that way. And when we publish the articles, there will be R code associated with it. It's a lot of code. So I don't know how many people are going to want to dig through it. And I guess I can say that at least and this is kind of getting at Bill Uline's question, do you know if the joint venture partnerships are using this information to inform decisions? So it's taken us a long time to get through. It was just such a big bite to make the bird and the skimmer and turn models. And so what we're about to do is for the skimmer and turn model, we're about to re-engage with the Gulf Coast joint venture to go over what I was saying and kind of my future things, working more closely with managers, now that we've got things that we think are functioning properly. And we've demonstrated through these simulations that we think we can address these questions. So we're going to work with the Gulf Coast joint venture to address that for skimmers and turns. Yes. I think there's kind of been a hold off on actually using to inform decisions because it's taken us so long to actually get to the point, and we want them out in journals so that people have some faith in them instead of me just telling them to believe in them.
Yeah, it looks, yeah, that's great. Thanks. Yeah. So are there any other questions either via chat or someone wants to ask one? And so the anticipation for this publication, James, is that it'll be out?
It's still in prep. The goal is to send it to the Journal of Wildlife Management. I think that's going to be if the Gulf sturgeon and beach mice were any indication, it's going to take a while to get it out. I mean, maybe it will be less for the birds because the sturgeon and the beach mice, right? Those are listed. And so just the scrutiny of those two was epic. So I'm going to guess it would take at least a year before it's out in a journal, right? It's got to get there and then it's got to be reviewed and I've got to reconcile. I mean, everybody knows what that process is like. So I'm anticipating it's going to take a long time for the bird models because of my experience with the sturgeon and beach mice.
Right. Okay, great. Well, it looks like we've come to the top of the hour. So Ashton, I'll let you bring us home to just close this up. But I want to offer my thanks to James for this really great presentation and for the questions afterwards.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, James. This was really informative. A really good discussion today. And we are 1 minute past, so I'll be quick. I just wanted to wrap up today by letting everyone know that we will be back in June for a summer series of science seminars. We're taking 1 month off but we'll be back in June, and we hope that everyone will plan to join us. Information for those seminars will be sent out next month, so please keep an eye out for more details on that. Finally, by registering for today's webinar, you'll also be subscribed for our monthly newsletter, where you'll be able to learn about these upcoming seminars and other events. So of course, you're welcome to unsubscribe at any time, but we hope you'll want to stay connected with us. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. And again, James, for your presentation and your time this morning. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and has a good lunch hour.
Thanks. Bye-bye all.
Thanks, Ashley.